Welcome to the deep dive. We've got just a fantastic collection of sources for you today. Everything from, personal stories to some really deep psychological research,
Hmm.
all focusing on gender identity and expression.
It's a fascinating topic, really cuts across so many areas.
Absolutely. And we're starting with something I think many people might connect with. It's an experience shared by a student, Joy Nash.
Oh, right.
Yeah, she talked about how she always felt sort of nerdy and tomboyish, but her family often pushed her towards more traditional feminine things.
Like dresses and...
Exactly. Frilly clothes, high heels, earrings, things she just didn't feel comfortable with. Not her style at all. She described her own traits, blunt, cynical, awkward, geeky, as putting her, and this is her quote, somewhere in between male and female characteristics.
That feeling of being in between is something we hear a lot.
It really is. And that, for you listening, that's the heart of this deep dive. We want to unpack what really shapes gender identity, gender expression, in the world today, moving beyond those simple black and white ideas.
Getting into the nuances.
Definitely. So let's kick this off with maybe the most fundamental question. This whole idea of traditional gender roles. Is it actually natural? Something we're just born with? Or is something else going on?
Yeah, that's the crucial starting point. We really need to separate two key ideas, sex and gender.
Okay.
So, drawing on sociologists like Judith Lorber and Kate Gills, sex is the biological stuff. Your anatomy, your physical characteristics, determined at birth. It's biology.
The hardware, so to speak.
Exactly, the hardware. Gender, though, that's more like the software. It's social, it's psychological. It's basically society's set of expectations, generalizations, really, about how men and women should look, how they should behave.
So not biological.
Right. The key thing to grasp is that gender isn't inherently tied to your biological sex. It's something society constructs, builds over time.
And history really backs that up, doesn't it? It gets incredibly interesting when you look back.
Oh, definitely.
I was looking at this piece by Sarah Bulboltz, and some of the historical shifts are just, wow. Like between 1918 and 1940, pink, the color pink was considered masculine.
Right. Strong, decisive, like red, but more suited for boys, apparently.
And blue was seen as dainty, delicate, feminine. It's the complete opposite of what most people think now.
Totally flips the script. And that's not even the only example. Think about high heels.
Ah, yeah.
In the Middle Ages, in Europe, high heels were strictly for men, exclusively.
Really? Why?
Well, the height often signified status, power. It was seen as a sign of masculinity. Depending on how high the heel, it showed your rank.
That's wild. So what we consider masculine or feminine is just malleable.
Exactly. It's always been a moving target. It shifts based on the environment, what society needs at the time, the cultural background. Pennsylvania State University research really confirms this.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about many older Native American tribes or certain African tribes. They often had matriarchal structures. Women were leaders. They were healers, central figures.
Very different from, say, historical Asian or European societies, which were often more male-dominated.
Precisely. A stark contrast. It shows how much culture shapes these roles.
You can even trace this way, way back. Early human societies, like in the Paleolithic era.
The nomadic times.
Right. Men generally hunted, women gathered food, looked after children. But, and this seems crucial, both jobs were seen as equally important.
Absolutely vital for survival. And both genders were seen as equal contributors because of that.
But then things changed.
Yeah, with the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture, settling down. That's when we see a major shift.
How so?
Well, societies became sedentary. Men tended to work the fields, more physically demanding labor in that context, while women often stayed closer to home, focusing on domestic tasks.
And that led to a change in value.
Unfortunately, yes. Because of the perceived differences in physical capability needed for that specific lifestyle, women and children started to be valued less in many societies.
But the key point there is perceived differences for that lifestyle.
Exactly. It wasn't about inherent worth or capability overall. It was about the societal needs and structures at that specific time, which brings us to today.
Right, because today, most of the really important jobs, lawyer, doctor, politician, tech CEO,
Are completely achievable by anyone, regardless of sex. Those old role divisions based on, say, physical strength for farming, they just don't apply to the vast majority of jobs now. They're largely irrelevant.
So taking that historical view, it tells us that these things we think of as fixed gender roles, they aren't fixed at all.
Not in the slightest. They were developed over time, they shifted, they adapted.
And if something developed and shifted over time, It can keep changing.
Absolutely. It sets the stage perfectly for what we're seeing right now.
Which brings us neatly to the present day,
Yeah.
2024.
Mm.
Because the concept of masculinity especially feels like it's really in flux.
It really is a profound transformation, as you said. Those traditional gender roles, they're not just being politely questioned anymore. No, they're being actively challenged, dismantled, reimagined. We're seeing men exploring and embracing really different ways of expressing who they are, moving way beyond those old rigid boxes.
And there's data backing this up, right? Some pretty compelling numbers.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The statistics paint a clear picture.
Like that Gallup poll from this year, 67% of men under 35 think traditional gender roles are outdated. That's 2/3.
A huge majority of younger men saying, nope, this doesn't work for us anymore. And think about emotional intelligence.
Right. That used to be labeled purely feminine.
Used to be. Now it's increasingly seen as just essential, a vital part of being a well-rounded person, and specifically part of modern masculinity. It's about strength and connection, not just physical power.
And there was that Pew Research stat, too. 45% of men reported taking on more caregiving since 2020.
Yeah, the pandemic shifted things, but it seems to have stuck for many. Taking on those roles actively reshapes how men view masculinity itself.
And maybe the biggest shift to mental health.
Huge. The APA finding that 80% of men now see mental health awareness as crucial. That's a sea change from the old stiff upper lip stigma.
So what's driving all this? It feels like a perfect storm.
It kind of is. Several big forces are at play. Media representation is definitely one.
How so?
Well, when you see more diverse male characters on screen, men who are kind, collaborative, emotionally open, vulnerable even, it helps broaden everyone's definition of what masculinity can look like. It normalizes it.
Makes sense. And generational changes.
Definitely. Millennials, and especially Gen Z, they grew up questioning norms. They're much more comfortable with fluidity, rejecting those strict traditional roles their parents or grandparents might have followed.
And social movements must play a part, too.
Absolutely. Movements for gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, even the growing conversation around mental health. They all challenge those old power structures and hierarchies. They encourage men, really everyone, to think more deeply about identity and vulnerability.
Okay, so we see the shifts happening, we see the drivers, but let's go deeper. What's happening psychologically? How do people, specifically men in this case, actually react when these long-held norms start to change? That's where some fascinating academic research comes in.
Right. This moves us beyond just observing trends into the underlying psychological mechanics.
So first we need a term, traditional masculinity. What does that mean in this context?
Okay, so traditional masculinity, or TM, isn't just one thing. It's more like a cultural blueprint, a set of beliefs and expectations about how men are supposed to behave.
Like what?
Often things like dominance, needing to be physically strong, emotional restriction, avoiding anything seen as feminine, that kind of cluster of ideas.
Okay, and this connects to other beliefs.
Yes, research links endorsing TM quite strongly to what are called gender hierarchy legitimizing ideologies.
That sounds complicated.
It's a bit academic sounding, but it just means beliefs that basically keep the existing gender hierarchy in place, with men typically having more status or power. So things like sexism. And it also includes something researchers call masculinist beliefs. This is the idea that masculinity itself is sort of under siege, maybe because of feminism or LGBTQ+ progress.
What do those beliefs look like?
It can include ideas that women actually have hidden privileges now, or that men are somehow victims in the modern world, or even downplaying the seriousness of violence against women.
Okay, so TM is linked to wanting to keep that hierarchy.
Yeah.
Now, how do men react when norms change?
Well, there are two main theories that predict different reactions. First, you've got social role theory, SRT.
SRT, okay.
This theory basically says, as society's roles change, like men doing more caregiving, which we just talked about, then men's attitudes should logically adapt too. They should become less likely to hold on to those hierarchy-supporting beliefs.
Makes intuitive sense. Roles change, attitudes follow. What's the other theory?
The other one is precarious manhood theory, or PMT.
Precarious manhood. Sounds fragile.
Kind of, yeah. The core idea is that manhood isn't seen as a stable, inherent state like womanhood often is. It's viewed as something that has to be achieved, earned, and importantly, it can be easily lost.
Okay. So how does that relate to changing norms?
Well, PMT suggests that if traditional masculinity feels challenged, say, by this perceived feminization of norms, men might react defensively. They might feel the need to push back, to reassert their masculinity.
And that could lead to...
Potentially an increase in endorsing those hierarchy-legitimizing beliefs, like sexism and masculinist ideas, a kind of backlash to protect that precarious status.
So two competing ideas, adaptation versus backlash. How did researchers test this?
They did a couple of really interesting quasi-experimental studies focusing on heterosexual men. First, they measured how motivated each man was to protect traditional masculinity, sort of a baseline reading.
Okay, how traditional they were to begin with.
Exactly. Then they exposed different groups of these men to different kinds of information. One group read something suggesting men's norms are becoming more feminized. Another read something reinforcing traditional norms. And a control group got neutral info.
And then they measured their beliefs again.
Precisely. After the exposure, they measured how much the men endorsed sexism and those masculinist beliefs we talked about.
Okay, moment of truth.
Yeah.
What did they find? This is where it gets really fascinating, maybe even a bit counterintuitive.
It really is. Let's start with the less traditional men, the ones who weren't highly motivated to protect TM at the start.
Okay, what happened with them?
When they were exposed to the information reinforcing traditional norms, their endorsement of sexism and masculinist beliefs actually went up.
Wait, really? Even though they weren't strongly traditional to begin with?
Yes. It suggests that just making those traditional ideals salient, just bringing them to mind, can exert a kind of pressure, pulling even less traditional men towards conforming to them, at least in their stated beliefs.
Wow. Okay, what about when they heard about the feminization norms? Did that decrease their sexist beliefs, like SRT might predict?
Interestingly, no. Exposure to the feminization norm information didn't significantly decrease their endorsement of those hierarchy-legitimizing beliefs. It didn't push them further away from tradition, but reminding them of tradition pulled them closer.
Okay, that's one group. What about the more traditional men, the ones who started out highly motivated to protect TM?
This is perhaps the most surprising part. For those men, there was no significant change in their endorsement of sexism or masculinist beliefs, regardless of which information they were exposed to.
None at all, whether they heard norms were changing or staying the same?
No significant difference across the conditions.
Huh. Why do you think that is?
Well, the interpretation is that these men might already feel sort of chronically threatened or vigilant about protecting the gender hierarchy. Their baseline level of endorsing these beliefs might already be quite high.
So hearing that norms are changing doesn't really push them further because they're already kind of maxed out on defending tradition.
That's one strong possibility. Or they're just consistently motivated to uphold that hierarchy, and these specific messages didn't shift that underlying motivation much. Their default position is already strongly aligned with maintaining the status quo.
So the big takeaway here seems pretty stark.
It really is.
Traditional masculinity, or even just the idea of it being the norm, can have these quite harmful effects on gender relations. It can actually nudge even less traditional guys towards more sexist viewpoints when those old norms are highlighted.
Yeah, it suggests that simply making traditional norms salient can be, well, the study calls it potentially onerous. It puts pressure on people.
So let's bring all of this together now. We've looked at history, modern trends, deep psychology. What does this mean for you listening right now and for society moving forward?
I think the clearest message is that these gender roles, they aren't set in stone. They're not innate. They're absolutely human constructs.
Built over time.
Built over time, constantly shifting based on our needs, our perceptions, our cultures. And that research we just discussed really highlights how sensitive people can be to messages about these norms.
Especially those traditional norms, which can feel burdensome even for people who don't strongly identify with them.
Exactly. And we know from other sources, too, that rigid gender roles have real downsides.
Yeah, the sources mention things like condemnation, oppression, just holding people back from being fully themselves, reaching their potential.
It's a significant barrier, but the good news is because these are constructs, we can work to change them, to make them more flexible and inclusive.
So how do we do that? What are some practical steps drawing from the materials we looked at?
Well, several strategies emerge. First, encouraging more open dialogue, creating spaces, where men especially can talk honestly about their experiences, their struggles, their emotions, without that fear of judgment.
Breaking down the man box idea.
Precisely. Second, actively promoting emotional intelligence. Not seeing it as feminine, but as a core human skill. Empathy, listening, communicating effectively. These are crucial for relationships, for work, for everything.
Recognizing it as a strength.
Absolutely. And third, really supporting mental health initiatives, making education and counseling accessible, normalizing seeking help. That directly tackles the stigma we talked about earlier.
And it's also important, isn't it, to just acknowledge the diversity of gender itself?
Hugely important. Remembering that gender isn't just male-female. It exists along a spectrum.
Right, we hear terms like agender, gender fluid, omnigender, bigender.
Yeah, all reflecting that richness and complexity. It underlines that gender is definitely not clear-cut, and it never really has been, despite societal attempts to make it seem so.
So on a societal level, what can help foster this broader understanding?
Well, media representation, again, is key, showing more positive, relatable portrayals of people who don't conform to traditional roles. Could be anyone, really. A transgender teenager navigating school, a professional athlete who embraces traditionally feminine interests or styles. Just normalizing diversity.
Makes sense. What about education?
Crucial. More comprehensive lessons in schools, starting early about the difference between biological sex and social gender, and talking openly about the complex feelings teenagers might have during puberty regarding identity, giving them the language and understanding.
So as we wrap up this deep dive today,
Yeah.
the core idea seems crystal clear. Gender roles, they're dynamic, they're social, they're constructed. They are not static biological facts. And how they evolve, how we talk about them, has these really profound psychological and social consequences.
Absolutely. It touches every part of our lives. And maybe a final thought for you to mull over.
Go.
Given that traditional masculinity, as we've seen, is often linked to beliefs that uphold men's dominance over women, what does it truly mean for each of us to embrace our own authentic truth, regardless of those pressures? And maybe more importantly, how can we together build a society where everyone feels empowered to contribute fully, completely free from those outdated, often harmful expectations?
It's like a really powerful question to leave us with. Plenty to reflect on as we all navigate this incredibly complex, constantly evolving part of being human.